So let me tell you why I'm really particularly interested in these three panelists. And I'm going to give each of them, hopefully Eric as well, an opportunity to describe their background and where they're coming from and some of their initial thoughts on this. But Victor Peikoff, and by the way, for those who weren't here this morning when I mentioned, in addition to being a preeminent neurotechnology researcher himself, an entrepreneur himself as the founder of MetaPace. He's also helped us in the launch of our new publication, Bioelectrics Business Report. So Victor writes a very well-regarded column in the newsletter, and his background is having spent time at GSK, which later became Galvani, having been a researcher, and now being an entrepreneur who knows the device world well, who knows the pharma world well. I thought he'd be in a good position. And we're also really, really fortunate to have Marco Serrani with us as well. And again, I'll give him a chance to describe his background. But here's a person who's an executive at Genentech, one of the nation's largest and most significant biotechnology firms. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the company. But he's also has an interest and awareness in the device world. And so I think he's in a really good position to share some of his insights. So in a moment, I'm going to give each of them a chance to give their initial thoughts, and then we're going to move into some moderated panel discussion. But before we do that, I'm going to share some insight from Brett Wall, a person who would not be here, but he's the executive vice president and the president of all of Medtronic's neuroscience portfolio. So they've just recently reorganized. Can you not hear me? Make my slide bigger. There's nothing there. It's an audio, so that's why it's up there. Okay, I thought you were saying I was too fat, but which is true, but irrelevant. So Brett Wall is in charge of everything neuroscience related, that Lothar used to do and more. So he's in charge of DBS, he's in charge of neuromodulation, he's in charge of pain, he's in charge of, so he happened to be at the Device Talks West conference, which was in Santa Clara a couple of weeks ago. Was anyone there? I thought, Mark, you were there because I saw you there. But I thought it was a good talk, and I had a chance to chat with him and ask him a specific question. So I'm going to play his response just a couple of minutes, and then we'll move into the discussion. Medtronic's neuromodulation devices are active in a lot of areas, indications where there's also pharmaceutical interventions. And I'm curious to get your opinion on what it's like now versus maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago to try and commercialize a device therapy where there's already pharmaceutical interventions. Is there a bias out there? If so, is it getting better? Is it getting worse?
I think what happens, like epilepsy is a good example of that, right? We have indications for epilepsy, which I forgot to mention, but we have indications there. And, every so many years, a new drug will come out on epilepsy. And frankly, if one of those drugs would work and work well and have, consistent results over time, I think we'd all celebrate that, quite honestly, because when you talk to parents or other people that are affected by epilepsy, it's a thing. And what we see is probably what you'd expect. A new drug comes out, we'll see maybe some impact, to the ability, the revenue of the device, the number of procedures that are put in, the number of technologies that are put in. And then what happens usually over time is, so far this has happened, is the drug doesn't quite work as well over time as people thought, and people kind of come back to the technology and we make some more enhancements to it. I think the other thing, though, is we see a lot of times where the device itself and the drug can work in combination together, and that's what happens with DBS. And if you look at levodopa, all those patients have that. And the idea is, can we work with levodopa, particularly when we can sense and see where maybe the drug is falling off, or we can do stimulation or do some other types of patterns of stimulation to get that patient back into that therapeutic zone where they can get there. So I actually think there's an opportunity there, even in conjunction, where these things can work together and do very well. And that's kind of been the story for us so far. But I'll be the first to say if a drug would come out that would be, very few side effects and would do all these things and have a long-term effect, we've got enough to do. We could go figure out something else to go do. That I think I'd applaud that, actually, because it'd be good for patients.
Let me turn it over to Victor at first. And Victor, do you want to give us just a quick background on yourself, your company, and then any initial thoughts you have on this whole issue of, is there bias out there?
Right. So I think that we're here talking about neuromodulation in general, and I think that we should not exclude the areas below the neck. And I think that's where, in my opinion, actually a lot of cross-pollination and synergies can come from in the future. I'm referring to the bioelectronic medicine,
Yes.
and this is the area where Galvani is active, and other companies, and our company Medipace is active in that area as well. So later, when we have more time for discussion, I can give you a couple of examples for such synergies. But yeah, our company is interested in autoimmune disorders, specifically for gastrointestinal diseases. Thank you.
Okay. Marco, do you want to give us a little background on yourself and your role at Genentech, a little bit on your background?
Sure. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Marco Serrani. I am a director at Genentech in our development sciences group. By way of background, I did my graduate work here in the Bay Area at UCSF in bioinformatics, working in the neurosurgery intensive care unit to try to manage all of that high frequency physiological data that we capture when we do surgery on traumatic brain injury patients. I started my career in the software industry, working in the software industry for about 10 years. And most recently, I've been at Genentech for about 15 years, working in biomarker discovery and strategy, and also working in portfolio management to think about how we invest our multi-billion-dollar research and development portfolio. From a personal perspective, I sustained a spinal cord injury about 28 years ago in a surfing accident. And over the course of that time, I've been frustrated to see the pretty much total lack of interest in spinal cord injury from the biopharma industry, but very excited to see the progress that's been made, particularly recently in devices, and really just trying to figure out how we can support that from the biopharma side.
Great. Okay. Thanks for that, Marco. And I have a couple of questions I want to follow up with. But before we do, since we're probably not going to hear from Eric, I want to give Eugene, who's I'll hand you the mic. And really, Eugene, just give us a couple of words of background about Wilson Sonsini, maybe something about what you're doing and your firm's role in the medtech and neurotech space.
Sure thing. Hello, everyone. I've been coming into this conference for a couple of years now. For those of you who don't know me, I will get around to you eventually. Background, electrical, biomedical engineering, University of Michigan, undergrad to PhD. Background in, I guess I did some DSP, did some MEMS, made innovations from the Michigan electrode technology. I made movable electrodes. So I made electrodes move from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions and use the shape memory polymers in order to do that. Happy to talk about if anyone wants to make their electrodes move. Always excited to talk about my research. But then I had my own stint of trying to be an entrepreneur and learned that they didn't teach you anything about running a business or anything about patents or freedom to operate, anything like that. And so then I decided to pick that up as well. So I started out doing patent prosecution and then got into patent litigation, worked in a couple of different firms. Now I'm currently in law school, about to finish in May. And I've learned that the different firms are good at different things. Wilson Sonsini is really great at supporting early stage companies. With the previous firm I was working at, it was actually really interesting. I was actually at this conference, and there was an entrepreneur that wanted my help, and I went to my partner and I said, "Can I help them?" Like, they wanted me to even do something like a freedom to operate type thing, and they said no, they were too small. They said, "Oh, it had to be like $500 million or something," and they said you couldn't do it. And I was like, well, that's the reason why I went through this training, is to help people like this, because it was a professor who wanted to translate their work. And so then I realized I was in the wrong place. So I found a home at Wilson Sonsini. They cater to people like that, to entrepreneurs who are willing to, Wilson takes risk on people like that as well. My colleague Eric wasn't able to join today, but also we are in a niche practice to try to support people in this room. It's exactly the type of practice that we'd like to support. This is actually, I've got 2 previous clients from this conference, so that's why we're regulars. So Spark Biomedical is a former client of mine. So I think the idea is in this space of, if you need the support of the venture capital mix with the IP due diligence and developing the initial portfolio, if you need coordination with that, that's where we come in.
Okay, Eugene, thanks very much. And we may call on you later, or we may call on Darby. Hopefully we'll be in the cocktail reception. But I at least wanted to give you the opportunity to say a couple of things about your firm, since Eric had a family emergency and wasn't able to come. Okay, with that, let's move into the panel discussion. And I want to follow up with a couple of things that each of you said. I'm just going to start with you, Marco. And definitely I want to get into your role at Genentech, because it's really important. And in fact, you know, there aren't a lot of executives in the pharma industry that are really strong proponents of looking for new technologies in medtech and neurotech in particular. So I want to explore that. But before we do, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your own personal experience, because I had an opportunity in the very early days of this publication to meet Christopher Reeve, which I think was 2001, 2002. And as many of us will recall, he was a very powerful advocate for more research into SCI. But he was also someone who, at least in our view, had a bias towards a pharmaceutical therapy. In his mind, he wanted a cure. He wanted a pill. In fact, he even mentioned this on a couple of, he wanted a pill that you could take that would cure his paralysis, and he wanted it done in his lifetime. Now, the bad news is, unfortunately, we weren't able to deliver on that. And he passed away, you know, before there was a cure to paralysis. But the good news is that progress was made, and that over the course of his advocacy, whereas he started out as a guy looking for a pill that was going to, he became later in life, not just, you know, like the Hair Club for Men guys, not just an advocate, but a user of neurotechnology. He was the first patient to be implanted with the phrenic nerve stimulation system that was invented by Case Western Reserve University, my old professor, Tom Mortimer. And he loved it. He spoke glowingly about it because it freed him from dependence on the ventilator. If you're a high-level quadriplegic, as he was, you know, you literally depend on every breath on that piece of machinery, which of course interferes with your you know, speaking. You have to time your speech, and so, you know, once he tried that system, he became a big proponent. And then later on, he got hooked up with a neurologist by the name of John McDonald. Unfortunately, Dr. McDonald passed away. He's not with us anymore, but he was at Kennedy Krieger and was really, I don't know, does anyone here remember John McDonald? We actually had him as a speaker in the early days of the Neurotech Leaders Forum. But he was Christopher Reeve's neurologist. And he was of the belief that with focused neurorehabilitation, we can restore function. We can restore function to people with spinal cord injury, even people with a complete. Now, today, that's not such a controversial statement, right? Gregoire Courtine at EPFL and at Onward and his colleagues in the US, and I use the word colleagues loosely, Reggie Edgerton and Susan Harkema have demonstrated, maybe not in hundreds, but in dozens of people with SCI, that yes, we can restore. But back in 2002, 2003, that was hearsay. I mean, that was, you were a heretic if you were a neurologist and you said, yeah, we can take someone with a complete spinal cord injury. But in fact, Dr. Kennedy was able to get Christopher Reeve to walk. Now, the catch is it was in a pool. Okay. So there, the weight bearing issue wasn't there, but he was able to move. He was able to get sensation that he never had before. And in many respects, I wonder to this day whether the work that had been done in neurorehabilitation was maybe a forerunner of the work that Dr. Edgerton and Dr. Courtine have really progressed. As I mentioned this morning, they've become, Wall Street darlings. And, all of a sudden there's financial interest in neuroprosthetic approaches to treating SCI. So anyway, long way around my asking the question. In your opinion, do you feel that within the SCI community, there's maybe this initial bias towards looking towards pharma for coming up with the cure, as opposed to, hey, what can the healthcare industry in general, or the neural tech industry in particular, offer to help us? Sorry for the long-winded question, but that's my question.
Yeah, no problem. It's a lot to unpack, but I will say that people are on board with the approach now. The last I heard, there was a waiting list of 9,000 patients.
Wow.
To get involved with Susan Harkema's trials, and that's like 20 patients at a time. So that's a long waiting list. I think the issues are cultural and they're economic.
Mm-hmm.
So culturally, let's face it, we'd all like to just take a pill and have our problems go away. That's just nothing against Americans, but that's the American way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just take a pill. But the other problem is economic, right? Pharma in some ways is a victim of our own success. The model works really well and drugs are very well priced. They're very well reimbursed. And even though only, let's say, 1 in 10 molecules ever makes it from phase 1 to the market, the industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Now, that has led to challenges in wanting to change the business model and to innovate. So, we use this analogy all the time that we're the super tanker. And if we need to change course, it takes us a very long time to change trajectory. We're trying to do that. So there's a lot more going on in computational biology and machine learning. There's a lot more going on in new modalities, so witness the COVID vaccines, mRNA, gene therapy, cellular therapy. But yes, in spinal cord injury, there is the bias. There was that early bias of like, let's discover a pill, a pharma treatment, or if not, maybe a cell therapy, right? But, now I think there is the realization that rehab in combination with devices, stimulation, certainly in the short term, that is going to be the way to go.
Interesting. Okay, so now I'd like to follow up with a question more about your professional role at Genentech. And I'm curious, I realize you're just one executive among many. It's a big company and it's a big industry with many companies besides Genentech. But from your experience as an executive in this industry, what do you think is the level of acceptance of people like yourself who might be on the edge to say, hey, we should consider non-pharma or even non-biologic therapies within our company? What's the level of acceptance, say today versus 5 years ago, and where you think it might be 5 years from now?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more acceptance to new modalities. I mentioned cell therapy, gene therapy, mRNAs, nucleic acid-based medicines. We're looking at all of those kinds of things in pharma. Those are still pharma approaches though, right?
Mhm.
So we're also looking at other kinds of supportive approaches like computational medicine. As to whether or not we'll get into devices, I don't know. So I've started kind of making a list during this conference of areas where that might work,
Mhm.
right? So one certainly is diagnostics. We've been involved in diagnostics for a long time, but again, the diagnostic is really meant to support the therapy. It's meant to identify patients who will either respond to a therapy or whose disease will progress so rapidly that they'll benefit from a therapy. Another area would be a drug graveyard, a place like Alzheimer's, where we've been trying for years and years and years to develop drugs in this space. For whatever reason, it's not working. Let's try something different. Now, that being said, just in the last few weeks, we've seen some very good Alzheimer's drug
Right.
data. So we'll see what happens. Another area would be a disease where it's just probably not druggable in the short term. So unlike an area like Alzheimer's, which if you figure it out, it might be druggable, I would say an area like spinal cord injury in the short term is probably not druggable.
Mhm.
The other areas where we're looking into devices, if you call them devices, would be areas like digital therapeutics. So can you identify?
And by the way, the FDA does call them devices.
Yes.
Their friends at the CMS, not so much. But
Yeah,
that's for
right.
tomorrow's discussion.
It's a low barrier to entry kind of a device, right? So, can you identify a smartphone app or maybe even like a virtual reality kind of a therapeutic or intervention that could benefit somebody through either a behavioral kind of an approach. So those are kinds of some of the areas that we're looking into. But in general, typically it's going to have to support something in the pipeline already.
Yeah.
It's typically not going to be a standalone. So at Genentech, we have marketed therapies in MS, in spinal muscular atrophy, and stroke. The areas that we would probably start to look at for devices would be areas that would be adjunctive to those drug therapies.
That's a great answer. Thank you. That sheds a lot of insight. Victor, I'm going to ask you the same question, and hopefully you can draw on your past experience at GSK, and being there in the early days when Galvani was spun off from GSK. So clearly, by virtue of their investments and what they've done, they're leading edge in the area of bioelectronic medicine by definition. But from your experience, what you saw of executives at the firm, executives in the industry, let me ask you the same question. Is it getting better? Is there more acceptance today than there was 5 years ago? What do you think it'll be like, 5 years in the future?
If I may a little rephrase this, because I'm prepared more to answer a question, why would they actually went into the business of bioelectronic medicine?
Okay.
So I would say that predating Galvani, in 2013, GSK went on a soul journey, and the reason for that was, and they hired McKinsey to help them with that. But the reason they actually went into their soul journey is because it's a process, something that's been happening since 1950s. And it's the fact that there are diminishing returns in pharma and biotech R&D. And this is actually, there is a term which is called, it's a reverse Moore's law, which is called Eroom's law.
What's it called?
Eroom, basically, it's a Moore spelled
Moore
backwards, yeah.
I
And
haven't
if you
heard that.
look, it's actually happening, it's happening every 9 years.
Right.
The cost of developing drugs doubles. So
Wow.
yeah, despite all the benefits of automated tools and productivity and other things. So since from 1950s to 2015, this plot has been made, and it's still actually it's now accelerating despite everything.
Eroom's law. I got to remember that one.
Eroom's law, and so because of that, GSK went on this whole journey, hired McKinsey. McKinsey said you have to basically devour yourself, have to basically disrupt yourself by creating your own enemy, kind of the medical devices that can solve your issues with the pharma. And so that was one of the reasons. Another reason is, of course, there are some diseases, like was mentioned, which are not druggable. And those include things like where people have multiple system issues, For example, if you take diabetes, obesity, typically you have multiple issues here. You have metabolic issues, autoimmune, and others, which cannot easily be drugged by a single target or even a couple of targets. It's whole systems are beginning to fail. So really you have to address it from the system level, which is something that autonomic nervous system is better prepared to do. Or in case where you have two diseases and one is a comorbidity, and it's very hard to treat those with drugs because you have to then titer each drug, and there is drug interactions, things like that. So that's where autonomic nervous system, which can target multiple system, can be potentially better or a good synergy.
Thank you, Victor. I think that's some good insight into both those firms. I'd like to ask a question now, following up on something I mentioned in my talk this morning, which has to do with time horizons, right? So I mentioned that the Broaden trial, for instance, that St. Jude Medical, now Abbott, conducted or sponsored back, 10 years ago, which was DBS of CG25 for treatment-resistant depression. Well, FDA did a futility analysis based on early data, and that early data wasn't so hot. Right now, there's other issues involved in that trial, just like there were other issues in the North Star trial failure, et cetera. But lo and behold, when you look, and it took many years, but Abbott eventually released long-term data. Every year the data got better, and this is not unique to DBS for depression. We've seen this. Mainstay Medical is another example of a company that did a clinical trial, failed to meet their primary endpoint after 6 months, right? But what they noticed is that as time went on, there was more and more divergence between the control group and the treatment group. So even though at the 6-month point, maybe it's not statistically significant, at 12 months, the data is looking better and better and better. And you get to a point where there's an ethical problem, right? There's an ethical problem with continuing a trial for 12 or 18 or 24 months where you're giving someone a placebo or sham stimulation. So the question I want to raise to both of you is, in terms of a clinical trial design, right? Is this an insurmountable disadvantage that a neuromodulation therapy has vis-a-vis a pharmaceutical therapy, where you can't just give someone a sugar pill really quick, and you can't necessarily make a quick determination after 3 months or even after 6 months? And if so, how do we deal with it? Marco, do you want to start?
Yeah, because actually, this is something that we're thinking a lot about from the perspective of trying to apply real-world data to supplement clinical trials. So, for example, if you run a clinical trial that either has a smaller patient population or a shorter time horizon, you might get something called a conditional approval from a regulator, but you're on the hook to continue to collect data in the real world from typically electronic medical records and things like that, so that you increase the pool and you increase the statistical sample to see what that efficacy is. And also you see the long-term safety and efficacy. So that's something that we're doing quite a bit of. I think the whole industry is doing that. Roche actually recently acquired a company called Flatiron Health that is really focused on cancer patients in the US to track their electronic medical record data. But I would imagine that that's a direction that the whole field will move in to sort of make it a little bit easier for companies, not just device companies, but smaller companies in general, to be able to make this a feasible value proposition.
Great. Victor, do you want to weigh in on the subject of time horizons?
Yeah, there is actually something that FDA recently introduced like a year or two ago, which is called adaptive study design, which is now.
I'm sorry, who released that?
FDA.
Oh, FDA did. Okay.
Yeah, which is an alternative that's being proposed to the typical randomized clinical trial design, but at a much lower cost, because now you don't have to do these large pools of population. But the catch here is that you really, like was said, you have to catch real-time data at home with these patients, really track them. So I think that's where the monitoring of patients at home comes. And that's where I think neural data monitoring can come in and help. So I think that's another point where might be synergy with neural tracking.
All right, very, very interesting. I have other questions I want to follow up with, but since we're down to our last 5 minutes, I want to see if anyone want to see it. I want to see it. We're not. Oh, we're good. Yeah, I want to see if anyone from the audience or on Zoom has any questions for our panel. Anyone on Zoom with a question? Anyone in the room that would like to ask a question? All right. If not, I will continue with mine. Next question, which is a follow-up on the previous question, having to do with the placebo effect. Okay. Now, if you're doing a drug trial, we all know what the placebo effect is. It's a sugar pill, right? There's not a lot of risk. There's not a lot of expense. It's an easy way to compare active therapy versus a control. In the neuromodulation space, it's a little more complicated. So the FDA in the past has mandated that you do some kind of sham stimulation. Now, the sham stimulation becomes a problem because guess what? It's not inconceivable that what we think is sham stimulation isn't really sham stimulation. People are getting therapeutic effect from that sham. And more than one, sadly, clinical trial has, has gone to its demise because of the fact that sham therapy, is not really sham. As I mentioned before, there's ethical issues. Is it ethical to surgically implant something in your body that doesn't do a damn thing, if indeed you could get it to not do a damn thing, right, and be ineffective? So aside from the issues of the practical issues of placebo control in a device trial versus in a pharmaceutical trial, the whole question of why is it that we feel we need to eliminate the placebo effect, why is that relevant, particularly in conditions like pain and mood disorders that are inherently subjective, right? By it's inherently subjective, I mean, how do we find out if someone's hurting? How do we find out if someone is depressed? Well, we ask them, how do you feel, right? Or we ask them, how bad's the pain? It's subjective, right? And there are theorists out there. Professor Fields from UCSF is one, but there are many others. In fact, Nans has done a couple of sessions on the biological underpinnings of the placebo effect, right? So is it conceivable that the placebo effect is part of the therapy? And if it is part of the therapy, why in God's name would you want to remove it, right? Why would you want to remove it if it can make people better? And even if it's only one component, in the therapeutic approach, that a pill or neuromodulation or magnetic stimulation or whatever is achieved, if there's a differential placebo effect between therapy A and therapy B, therapy A maybe is a drug, therapy B is, if there's a differential placebo effect, how is that the scientific method to throw that out? It's not, right? So I guess my last question to both of you is, do you feel we should continue, particularly for subjective disorders like pain and mood disorders, where there's not yet anyway a biomarker that says, yep, this guy's a 7. Oh, that person's a 2, right? Or that says, this person is severely depressed. Oh, this person's just mildly depressed. Without a biomarker yet that does that, should we continue to try to eliminate the placebo effect in clinical trials? Victor, you want to start? Sure.
I think it's a good question, but I think there is a way of one would, somebody like, if you are from a startup that has to comply with FDA, yes, you probably have to do it. But if you are a little bit try to be, I guess, innovative in your dealing with FDA,
we know what happens to those people.
So what you can suggest is, instead of having a regular placebo device, you provide a non-inferiority drug.
There you go. A
control.
non-inferiority trial could be the way around it.
Exactly.
Excellent idea. Love
Yeah.
that. Marco, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is a little outside of my wheelhouse, but I will say that in oncology, for sure, we've moved past placebo-controlled trials. I mean, you see a lot of single-arm studies in areas where there's no other option. You see a lot of studies against active comparators when there is an option. So I think actually the FDA has been quite innovative. But I will also say that that's what makes pharma a lot easier. Based on the little that I know about medical devices, it just seems harder. Because all we really have to prove is efficacy. You don't even necessarily have to prove a lot of safety in many more severe indications. So if you can prove efficacy, then the regulators will approve you, the reimbursement will pay for you, and the market will reward you.
All right, great.
One argument you can throw at FDA for non-inferiority is that drugs, at least many of them, their efficacy tapers over time. Well, with devices, as we see, it either stays flat or even improves. So you can say, even if it's non-inferior, in the future, it might become better.
Yeah, so those are really good thoughts that may factor into clinical trial design. We're just about out of time, but if anyone has a burning last question, I'll allow it, and then we'll wrap up. Eugene, go ahead.
Sure, it's more of a comment, actually. So I'm currently in law school and I'm taking a class on, I guess, the laws around artificial or assisted reproduction technology. And that's kind of a hot area of topic because it deals with people's, I guess, fundamental rights. And one of the issues that comes down to is this issue about what does the FDA have, their ability to regulate, what is their power to regulate things. And recently in the courts, they've been challenged, and in one case, they won. I guess they were.
Well, you're saying someone actually challenged the FDA's power?
Correct. Yes, and in one case they won. The other case they lost. To the extent in which they were able to regulate. In this case, it was stem cells, the use of a person's stem cells. And so I'm thinking, thinking outside the box. We, don't think that there's only one way to go about it. And I think that there is, they are an agency, and there's legal aspects of ways we can approach things as well.
Great insight. Thank you, Eugene. All right, I'd like to say thank you to our panelists, Victor, Marco, and Eugene.